Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stacy Sennett, Program Director at the National Kidney Foundation serving New England. I would like to thank everyone for joining. As we wait for additional attendees to join the webinar, I would like to take some time to go over some of the features you can utilize during our presentation. All attendees have been muted, and for any questions, please use the Q&A window. The Q&A window will allow you to ask questions to the presenters. To locate the Q&A window, hover your mouse over the screen, click the Q&A tab. Once open, you can type in your question into the Q&A box. Click send. The speakers will then answer your question live after the presentation. We can't promise all questions will be answered due to time commitments, but we will do our best. Again, thank you for joining this afternoon. I would like to introduce Medical Director of Kidney and Pancreas Transplant Program at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Dr. Chan Draker.
Good afternoon. So it gives me great pleasure to kick off this series of Kidney Crossroads webinars, which is a collaboration between the Brigham and Women's Hospital and the New England National Kidney Foundation. We plan to have a series of these every 1 to 2 months on different aspects of kidney disease and transplantation. Sometimes the format will be educational talks, sometimes round tables, sometimes there will be research forums. They will all have the common format of having question and answer sessions at the end of the meeting. This is really an opportunity for you and for us to be able to talk about topics that are pertinent to transplantation. As Stacy said, if you have a question, please send it through the question and answer tab. We cannot obviously discuss individual cases during this webinar. However, if you do have a question that we don't get to, we will endeavor to answer them personally afterwards. It really gives me great pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Dr. Lindsey Baden. I've known Dr. Baden for more than 2 decades. We both started at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in 1995. And so we have worked together during all of that time. Dr. Baden is the director of the Center for Clinical Research at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. He's also director of infectious diseases at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and he's chair of the Antimicrobial Drug Advisory Committee to the US FDA. But really more than that, he is an exceptional physician, a great friend and colleague, somebody who specializes in taking care of the high-risk patient, meaning the kidney, heart, lung, and stem cell transplant populations. He also has done pioneering research on the use of hepatitis C positive organs into hepatitis C negative recipients. We are really fortunate that he's able to join us today. And I will, with that, hand over to him. Thank you, Lindsey.
Thank you, Anil. And thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts. Just going to get my screen. Uploaded, it's coming. So thank you very much, Anil. And thank you all for inviting me to share some thoughts and have a dialogue with you about where do the SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID vaccines sort of fit in as they emerge, and given the importance, particularly in vulnerable populations, such as those with renal dysfunction or have received an organ transplant. And as Anil mentioned, he and I have worked together for a couple of decades in caring for patients, particularly patients who have received transplants. So this is an area of import to us, and very happy to have this discussion. So I just want to highlight a little bit about what we all know, but just to bring numbers to the forefront. SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19, this here from the New York Times this morning just shows how the cases in the US are just escalating, and this is spreading throughout our communities, and we know that. I want to remind people that this is a respiratory virus. I really can't stress that enough. It's a respiratory virus, like influenza, like other coronaviruses, rhinovirus, respiratory syncytial virus. It's something that spreads through our breathing, coughing, and that we need to remember that mask wearing, physical separation, minimizing gatherings, particularly in closed spaces, and routine public health measures, which is testing. And if you have COVID, you quarantine or isolate, and we do contact tracing. And we know that these approaches work really well at decreasing an individual's risk and the community risk. And I just want to stress that, because that's something we all can and should be doing today. This cartoon is just saying a little bit about the vaccine approaches. And so if we consider this cartoon here of the virus itself, it has this thing on the outside called the spike protein, and that it uses to grab onto cells and to get in. So it's a hook, so to speak, for the virus to get into the cell and cause infection, replicate, and then infect other cells. And this spike protein became a natural target because people who get COVID and get better from it, they have a strong immune response to this spike or this hook on the outside of the virus. And so we were able to take this and say, let's make vaccines based upon it. And what vaccines do is they deliver something to the immune system, so you make an immune response, preferably without having the infection. And you can't get the infection from any of these vaccines. It just makes the immune response, so if you see the bug, you already are primed to prevent it from causing trouble, as we do with our other vaccines for polio and measles and mumps and rubella and tetanus and pertussis, all sorts of vaccines that prevent problems because they get the immune system juiced up to fight the pathogen before you see it. Different ways to give the immunogen, or this thing that we want the immune system to respond to. We can give it by DNA or RNA delivery systems, by recombinant viral vectors, that's the adenovirus 5 or adenovirus 26, or in the UK, it's the chimp adeno. Just giving the spike protein itself, we do this every year with the flu shot. We just take a piece of the spike or this hook. Or you can just inactivate the virus and just say, can we give the whole virus and let the immune system respond to everything in it? This here is a schematic of Operation Warp Speed. That's what our government, the Department of Health and Human Services, helped nucleate or inspire to be able to develop the vaccines faster, because a year ago when we had SARS-CoV emerge, we had nothing to do about it. There was so much sickness, and we needed to come together as a community, the government, the regulators, the NIH, industry partners, academic institutions, clinical scientists, patients, and the community to say, how do we all come together and rapidly make vaccines or countermeasures? What this sort of shows is it shows that 6 different constructs were moved very quickly forward. Moderna and BioNTech, that's Pfizer, with the mRNA platform. AstraZeneca or the Oxford group and Janssen with the adenoviral vector or viral delivery platform, and Novavax and Sanofi with the recombinant protein. All of them use the spike or this hook on the outside as the primary target. Whether it's 1 dose as with the Janssen or 2 doses with the other, there are different strategies of how to give it. The first 2 have already had efficacy data and have been a EUA or emergency use authorized by the FDA. These 2, the AstraZeneca and the Janssen, are in advanced phase 3 testing, and we're hoping to get data in weeks. The AstraZeneca or Oxford has been reviewed in the UK, the United Kingdom, and has been advanced there for clinical use. It's still being evaluated here. And these 2, we hopefully will have the phase 3 data looked at soon. And then Novavax and Sanofi are still in process. So let me talk just briefly about the mRNAs to sort of give the key data that I think establish how we should think about how well it works. The Pfizer BioNTech, it's a 2-dose regimen, 21 days apart, full-length spike protein. The Moderna, which was developed in collaboration with the NIH, the VRC, the Vaccine Research Center at the NIH, done in conjunction with the NIH network, the CoVPN or COVID Prevention Network. This is what the product is called. It's given at 28 days apart, also the full-length spike. Both of these phase 3 studies started on July 27th, so 6 months ago, which just speaks to how quickly we're moving to get some answers so we have more countermeasures to stop this virus from spreading and causing as much sickness as we're all witnessing. So what the phase 3 trial looks like, and these are details for the Moderna one, but the Pfizer looks very similar. It's 30,000 people, half get vaccine, half get placebo. They get the 2 vaccinations. It's people at high risk for getting COVID or getting sick from COVID, such as our senior citizens. And that the populations in these studies, we really push to try to represent the nation as much as possible. The Pfizer study is 44,000 people, a 21-day regimen, but very similar concept. And the primary outcome was, could we prevent people from getting sick from COVID? Meaning they get fever, chills, sweats, cough, difficulty breathing. So could COVID illness be prevented in those who receive the vaccine? And both the Pfizer study and the Moderna study have been recently published in the last few weeks. Here's the Moderna study. What I wanted to highlight in this is that about a quarter of the people were older than 65. About 20% were Latinx. About 10% were Black or African American. And just a footnote, because I've received so many questions about this, about 2% had already had COVID. And we didn't know it, we knew it on blood tests. So about 300 people who got vaccinated had already had COVID, because people have been asking a lot about this in terms of side effects. This here is showing the side effects, and the main side effects that we have seen. This is the percent of people who have a side effect. Here is any side effect: pain, redness, swelling, some swollen glands. This here is systemic: fever, headache, fatigue, myalgia, arthralgia, nausea, vomiting, chills. This is after the 2 doses of placebo, the 2 doses of vaccine. And so, like penicillin, things have side effects. The side effects, for the most part, are modest. They occur more after in the vaccine group than the placebo group, and more after the second dose than the first dose. What these typically were some malaise and fatigue that lasted about a day after the second vaccination, went away without any problems. But there are some side effects. The benefit, which side effects always have to be looked at in terms of the benefit, and what this curve shows is the cumulative event rate. How many people got sick with COVID? And here is time, days since first vaccination out to 120 days. This is the people who were in the placebo group, so no vaccine. This is the vaccine group. The vaccine's given at day 0 and day 28, and what one sees is that the curves start coming apart by about 2 weeks and continue to come apart, with a lot more in the placebo group getting infected than the mRNA or the vaccine group. There were 185 symptomatic infections in the placebo group, 11 symptomatic infections in the vaccine group. So about a 93% efficacy from preventing people from getting sick with COVID. And what's also notable is that within the first few weeks of vaccination, one sees that in the placebo group, you have about 60, 70 cases in the first 6 weeks, while in the vaccine group, it's only 7. Some have said, why not just go with one vaccine? What I want to show you is that 96% of people got a second vaccine here at day 28. So all the data after day 28 are 2 vaccine data. So we don't know how well one vaccine works out months. Maybe it works well, maybe not. We just don't have the data to be confident with exactly how a single vaccination behaves beyond 4 to 6 weeks. This here are 2 important things here. One is for those who are baseline infected with SARS, already had SARS. One of them in the placebo group had a clinically symptomatic infection, none in the vaccine group, no difference in side effects from the vaccine. The other, which I think is the most important data, are how many people got really sick with COVID, meaning they got hospitalized, they couldn't breathe, they needed oxygen. there were 30 people who got sick in the placebo group, 0 in the vaccine group, suggesting that it can prevent you from getting seriously sick, which is consistent with preventing you from getting sick at all. The Pfizer data, which is a totally separate study, 44,000 people, but largely the same design. I won't go over in detail other than to say the results look almost the same. Some reactogenicity, meaning some side effects a day or two after vaccination, more so after the second vaccination, transient, gone by day 2 or so after the second vaccination. And the efficacy, how well does it work? This curve looks almost identical to me, which is somewhere on day 14, those in the placebo group still get sick from COVID, while those in the vaccine group stop getting sick from COVID, with a similar drop-off in the early days post-vaccine. So to me, this is 2 separate vaccines, same platform, same kind of insert, same kind of design, but 2 totally independent studies showing largely the same result with high evidence of preventing people from getting sick from COVID. So where are we today? We know that the Pfizer vaccine got their emergency use authorization on December 11th. The day after, the FDA gave it the, the 11th was when they granted the emergency use. The day after, the CDC, or the ACIP, which is the CDC Vaccine Committee, recommended its use. 2 days later, it was being shipped to states. Moderna had the exact same process a week later. And over the last 2 to 4 weeks, all of us have been witnessing the rollout of these vaccines. There are cold chain considerations for these 2 vaccines because they have to be stored a certain way. And each company has said that they're looking at approximately 1 billion doses this year each. So hopefully that can alleviate the supply issue, but obviously not soon enough given how much COVID we're all seeing. The viral vectors, which I briefly mentioned, which was the AstraZeneca and the Janssen, these are moving along quickly. We look forward to the formal efficacy data, hopefully in a matter of weeks or a month or so. I do want to stress safety. All of these constructs have phase 1, phase 2 studies, and the pivotal phase 3 studies. The PSRT is the safety review team, reviews all the safety data every week. The Data Safety Monitoring Board, which is impaneled by the NIH, is reviewing all the data periodically. The FDA has reviewed it, the ACIP and the CDC review it, peer-reviewed journals have reviewed it, states departments of health, academic centers, physicians, care providers, and communities like us have a chance to interrogate, debate the data, and see how it fits into our preferences for health. So there still are many unknowns, and we're going to discuss some of these shortly. We know about side effects that are since about 30 to 40,000 individuals received the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine. We know that side effects that occur in about a 1 in 10,000, 1 in 20,000 rate will have seen. Things that occur in 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million, 1 in 100 million take a larger deployment to better understand. We've all been watching the anaphylaxis story. It's a small number, but it's a very important number that we are paying attention to and trying to better understand how well these vaccines work in special populations, such as immunocompromised patients, patients who have had a transplant, patients on biologic therapy, persons who are pregnant, in our children, better understanding in those who previously had SARS-CoV, what to do with 1 or 2 or 1 or 3 doses, how long does the immunity last, can we do half dose, what does this do on transmission. I will stress that if you've been vaccinated, we still want you to wear masks, wash hands, and minimize the risk of transmission until we have full control of this virus. And then many of us have been watching the viral evolution. Is the virus changing in a way where we need to change what we do? And that's an ongoing process. We expect the virus to change, and we'll just have to continue to monitor it to see if it has any implications. So I'll just briefly comment that all of this work over the last year has been a tremendous effort. I think the NIH, the BARDA, which is part of HHS, our industry colleagues, the regulators, the investigators, the teams, the community, the volunteers. There are just so many who have contributed so much to allow us to develop a vaccine. But it is terrific in my view that we're at a point where we have something that works, and now we figure out how best to deploy it so we can prevent illness. So I will stop here and thank you all for your attention. I wanted to give you some overview of where we are with the vaccines and how we've developed them.
Lindsey, thank you very much. I mean, that was a very excellent summary of where we are. And I'd really encourage people to sort of ask questions or post comments, and we'll try and get to as many of these as we can. I think sort of the first question is from one of our participants who's asking, were there any transplant patients part of the trial?
No, persons on significant immunosuppression were not in the phase 3 trials. In part, when we designed the phase 3 trials, we didn't know if it would work. So we tried to make it as inclusive to represent the nation as possible, but we did stay away from those individuals on active chemotherapy or on significant amounts of immunosuppression because we just didn't know enough at the time.
So I mean, I think that's really to another question. Can you say something about how patients who are on immunosuppression respond to vaccines compared to the general population?
So separate from COVID vaccines, we do know that our patients on immunosuppressives may not respond as well to vaccines, either by seroconversion at all, or if they do seroconvert, that the strength of the immune response may not be as strong as young, healthy people. And that's something we're aware of. And there are some strategies for certain vaccines, like the hepatitis B vaccine, where we can alter the vaccine regimen to try and overcome that. But that's something that is an issue, because with blunting the immune response to the organ, let's say the transplant, it also blunts it to responding to a vaccine or a new antigen.
Thank you. If a patient, if a transplant recipient has allergies, is there any concern to this patient receiving the vaccine? What are the recommendations?
So that is such an important question about the allergy issue. And we all watched it emerge in the UK when the first couple of patients were vaccinated there, and they had a couple of anaphylaxis episodes. And we don't fully know the allergy issue. It's an unpredictable reaction as to who'll be allergic to what medicine. What I think has emerged is that with the rollout of the COVID vaccine, that people who are allergy prone, meaning they carry EpiPens in their pocket because they've had anaphylaxis before, about half the individuals who have had a significant allergic reaction, meaning anaphylaxis, which is a small number, were people who were in this severe allergy phenotype. So I think that that's a marker of people who may be more reactive, but we actually don't know. There's a lot more that needs to be learned, and we can only learn it when we start vaccinating tens of millions to hundreds of millions of individuals to really understand the full side effect profile. But that's something we're watching closely.
Great, thank you. Another question, how long will the vaccine stay in the system? Will it be like a flu shot? Do patients need to get this every year? Or is it for a few years? Will it be integrated as part of the regimen that we recommend to special segments of the population?
So the durability of the immune response, and how long do people who have COVID have a protective immune response? If they got COVID, how long will that afford protection? And there, we don't know. We've only known about COVID for a year. So anything about COVID that we want to understand for more than a year does not exist. What does that mean for the vaccine? Well, we have vaccine data for about 6 months. So we don't know the durability of the immune response at a year or 2 years, and that's something we will monitor. And if there is waning immunity, then the question of boosting will come up. The other question is, which you're getting at with the flu shot, is there variation in the strain? So we need to modify the vaccine because the virus itself is changing, and we need to have the vaccines keep up with the virus. These are all things we don't know. My hope is that the immune response will be robust and last years, and that the virus won't change. But we'll only know that when we get to a year out to be able to do the monitoring necessary.
Thank you. So there's a question. I can answer the next one. Is the webinar being recorded? Yes. So that's an easy one for me. And I think if you're registered, you'll get a link. Stacey will also go over that right at the end as well. So I think the questions about the rollout of the vaccination within Massachusetts, and one thing I do want you to comment on is that Massachusetts is one state within New England, and each state has its own rules. That's one thing, and it's the question is really Massachusetts is prioritizing patients with 2+ comorbidities. Are CKD and post-transplant status separate comorbidities? So what specifically, how do you count them in our population?
Well, I am not part of the committee determining how it gets rolled out in Massachusetts or other states. I do think that the unevenness of the criteria across states lends itself to a lot of confusion. And I think how we are rolling out the vaccine also lends itself to confusion because of if we have 20 million doses and we only give 4 million, we have 15 million doses that we could have given, and how can that alleviate the stress? And for all of us who have comorbid conditions, we all want to be vaccinated, or at least I think we should be vaccinated, and we should figure out how to enhance the rollout. But how one prioritizes a medical condition A or B is not something I'm part of. So it's hard for me to give a direct answer to what states may or may not do. My fundamental view is vaccines should not be wasted, they shouldn't be thrown out, and they shouldn't be in the freezer. We need to figure out how to get the vaccines into people so that we can stop the transmission. And the only way to do that is to have massive vaccination systems set up well beyond what we're doing currently.
Right, and I believe that in Massachusetts, they're dropping the age now in terms of who would qualify. Is that correct?
Yeah, they're dropping the age, but will things change in a week or two if the supply is doubled? So I think, like everything, every week there'll be new information that'll change how we do the rollout. My hope is we continue to accelerate and reach more people.
Okay. So another question, if somebody is fully vaccinated and who comes into contact with a COVID positive person, then is it still possible to pass along the virus to others who may not have been vaccinated? So I guess there's two parts to that. If you're vaccinated, is there any possibility you may still pass it on? And if you are vaccinated, can you still get a mild form?
Yep. So for most of these questions, I'm going to say we don't know, but here's what I think. So I think that the issue of do vaccines stop transmission? We don't know. What we do know from the Modernist study is at day 29, right before the second vaccination, we did nasal swabs on everybody. And what we found was the vaccine group, about, I think it was 14 or 15 were positive, while in the placebo group, it was 38. So suggesting that there is decreased nasal carriage of COVID in people who are vaccinated, which suggests that we may decrease transmissibility. But those data are too small and too early to draw any firm conclusions. So that the hope is that vaccine will have such an effect, but we don't yet have the data to know.
Right. So I think there's a question here. Can a transplant patient get vaccinated now if the vaccine is available to them? And I think the answer is yes to that. We would recommend that, and I'll ask Dr. Baden to comment on this, but the guidelines from the American Society of Transplantation, which have been written by our transplant infectious disease colleagues, including some at the Brigham and Women's Hospital, do recommend vaccination for transplant patients. So I assume you would agree with that?
Agree. Yes, I would vaccinate.
Right.
If it doesn't work quite as well, it works better than nothing, than not being vaccinated.
And likewise, on a separate but very important topic, what about a living kidney donor? There's no reason, of course, for the kidney donor not to get vaccinated.
Agreed. I would vaccinate them as well, according to the usual priorities by the states.
Great. So just going through these, were there any patients with either CKD or autoimmune disease in trials?
No autoimmune disease, whether or not there was mild renal and no significant renal dysfunction, but whether there was mild renal dysfunction, we didn't measure it. But anyone who had a diagnosis of renal failure was not included.
Okay, and so I think one of the other important questions, and something that I think patients have heard something about, is timing post-transplant and vaccination, and how long after transplant are we recommending patients get vaccinated?
Yes.
Yes.
I think that is another very difficult one to answer. I would like the acute transplant issues to be quiet so that one has gotten through the acute transplant period, and then whatever can be delayed to let the immunosuppression be lowered as much as possible. So it's an opportunistic time as to when is the patient most likely to respond, not wanting to wait a year, but I think the first few weeks is clearly too early, so probably a couple of months.
Right. So, and I think that, there is there are various different thoughts on this, and that's why people will give you a range. So, but most transplant physicians are saying 2 to 3 months after transplant, as long as there are no complications like acute rejection that require extra immunosuppression for that patient. So right. So it does depend a little bit, but generally 2 to 3 months. Do we have any idea of the timeline and how transplant patients, meaning where, they will get vaccinated? Is it through the primary care physician or the transplant team or CVS?
Wherever you can get it. In Massachusetts, I know Gillette and Fenway, they're setting up massive vaccination setups. And I would say get vaccinated wherever you can get vaccinated.
And I spoke to Chuck Morris, who's leading the efforts at the Brigham Women's Hospital, or coordinating the efforts on vaccination, specifically about this. And I think it is exactly that. Wherever you can get the vaccine, there are going to be community centers that are set up. There are going to be other sites that are set up. There are going to be peripheral sites. It is, I think, unlikely that the Brigham and Women's Hospital will be setting up a site for vaccination for patients, but that hasn't been decided as of yet. And certainly there were really early efforts to try and get both CVS and Walgreens to be hubs for vaccination. So I think it's one of those things where we're just learning as we go along, but basically wherever you can get it. I think we will try to update our patients online as soon as we know exactly where. But basically, yep, if you can get it now because you meet the criteria, then get it now. If you can get it later, then get it as soon as you can, and get it wherever you can. Another question, what do we know, if anything, about the impact of vaccine side effects over a couple of years? It seems that the side effects you were talking about in the paper were relatively minor.
I think that the side effects, I also view them as relatively minor. Almost all vaccine side effects are usually detected within a month or two post-vaccination, hence the FDA guidance that I briefly referred to. But we don't know anything about side effects at 1 to 2 years because we haven't followed patients long enough, but it would be highly unusual for a vaccine to have side effects at 1 to 2 years.
Another question about if a patient had become infected during the surge, should they still receive the vaccine?
And that's, I was getting that a little bit in the sense that we don't see any safety concern if you previously had SARS or COVID and then get the vaccine. Whether or not the immune response is that much stronger, we were seroblind and we enrolled people who had previously had SARS. So the current recommendations is just to vaccinate everybody. Logistically easier. We make sure that the immune response is stronger, but we don't know how much additional benefit vaccine has on top of having already recovered from SARS.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a little bit repetitive here, but I just want to make sure that we cover everything. One of the participants commented that they thought they had read that in the Lancet that some HIV patients had received the vaccine and was wondering what the response
Yeah.
was.
No, HIV patients were included in both studies, and no difference in side effects, no difference in efficacy, but then again, with so few vaccine failures, every group that got the vaccine benefited.
Question, is there a planned vaccine trial for people on immunosuppressants? Now, I can maybe just go first on this, because we did send a message out to our transplanted patients that trying to get a trial set up at the Brigham and Women's Hospital for the kidney transplant recipient patients. That is still not up and running. We are trying to get it up and running, but it may or may not occur in time. We will keep people posted. Certainly, if you have the opportunity to get the vaccine rather than waiting to be in a trial which may not happen for a while. And secondly, there are other studies that are ongoing that are monitoring the effects of the vaccine in people who are transplanted, seeing what their antibody responses are. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
No, we are looking at the immune responses after vaccination in all the key populations we've been discussing, because we need to know how the vaccine behaves in a patient who's received a transplant, a patient who's received Rituxan. So those kinds of blood draw studies, I call them, or observational studies, are, I'm certain, I know available here, and I'm certain at other centers, to demonstrate that the vaccine brings out the kind of immune response that we think is protective.
Right. Do you recommend one vaccine platform over another for transplant patients?
I recommend getting vaccinated when you can. And right now, the only platform available is mRNA, and the two of the products, the Pfizer and Moderna, as best as I can tell, look awfully similar. So to me, the issue is access. And the efficacy at 95% for both of them is really hard to do better than that.
Okay. There's a question about any studies to indicate if vaccination might cause organ failure in transplant recipients.
I'm not aware of any data that suggests that.
Neither am I.
I am aware of immunocompromised patients getting severe COVID and getting extremely sick. So COVID is a serious condition for all of us, and more so if your immune system is weak.
Right, and that leads to another question from that we've gone through here. Question is, I'm already immunocompromised because I'm on immunosuppression, but I'm also going to be having chemotherapy shortly. Will the chemo plus the immunosuppression make it less effective?
I think the more immunosuppression, the harder it is for a vaccine to be as effective as we would like. I still don't see any safety concern with the vaccine in that setting. So therefore, getting vaccinated may help the immune response and afford some protection, but it's hard to know how much.
Okay, here's an interesting question. So so in the studies, were the patients challenged with the vaccine, with the virus, or were they just allowed to go out into the community and see if they got infected?
We have not done challenge studies. That's been heavily debated. There's a strong scientific rationale, very exciting from a science standpoint, and allows rapid advancement of our understanding. But that is not how these studies were designed. These were, you are vaccinated, and then we're assessing acquisition in the community through average risk, just through our living our lives. And sadly, the amount of transmission in this country is such that we had such high rates of transmission.
Thank you. Another question. Some reports are describing local rash at the site of vaccine injection and adenopathy after the first dose. Is that a concern for the second dose?
Well, there is the reaction a day or two after being vaccinated, which is pretty straightforward, resolves. There's another kind of reaction that has been seen in a small percent of individuals about 10 days after vaccination, where the vaccine site gets a little swollen and red, and that goes away after a couple of days. second vaccinations given without difficulty. So not of any sequelae, but an oddity that people need to be aware of so they don't get overly concerned. Thanks.
So I think this is more a comment than a question, but maybe you'd like to discuss this. If immunosuppressed patients may not have an immune response to the vaccine, wouldn't it be prudent to vaccinate their family members that they are living with?
I think that is such an important question. And this now is less from the study and more just as a transplant infectious disease doctor. I think the most important people to vaccinate are the people around our patients, for pertussis, for influenza, as well as for COVID, because they're the most likely people to bring it home to their loved ones. So yes, this idea of cocooning or ring vaccination so that you have immune protection in the people around the most vulnerable, for our cancer patients, for our transplant patients, for our patients with severe comorbid illnesses. I think that's an incredibly important principle, but it's much broader than just for COVID.
Okay, so I think there's a question about what are the next steps in terms of communication from the hospitals to patients? Will there be ongoing communication relative to recommendations and resources? And the answer for us is yes, we certainly will be. And I'm sure the NKF will also be very important to keep everybody informed of what's going on. These are a little repetitive. I think we've answered a lot of these. Yep, so an important question here. If you get the first dose of one vaccine, can you take the second dose with the other vaccine? The current recommendation is you should get both doses of the same vaccine because that's what we know works. Okay. So I would stick with that because why deviate from what we know works? Okay. Is it recommended for patients who are pregnant or planning to become pregnant or breastfeeding? We don't know. There is some guidance would suggest that we should vaccinate pregnant women, given that the risk of COVID right now is just so high. And I know the ACOG, the American Academy of Obstetrics Gynecology, have recommendations in this space. There aren't strong directive data. There's just theoretical reasons to think that there shouldn't be an issue and practical reasons about how severe COVID is and how pregnant women are just as susceptible, if not more susceptible than many of us. Breastfeeding's not an issue, but pregnancy is just something we always think about so carefully. Okay, here's an important question. If you are getting rituximab, will the vaccine work? So we don't know. A repetitive refrain, I apologize. But of the biologics that we use, rituximab is one that I'm concerned about given its impact on the B cells. It doesn't affect the T cells, so that in theory, and I think in practice, you still get immunity through the T cell side of the immune system. But I do worry that the Rituxan may affect the B cells or the antibodies. We don't have data on it. It's something we're looking into. But I don't see a safety concern. So the question is, it may not work quite as well. That doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't potentially beneficial, but we need data to guide us. Okay. Can you get vaccination in another state if you live in Massachusetts? I'm not an expert on state rules. Yeah. I think the answer is if you, for some reason, have that ability, maybe you work in one state and live in another state, then you should go wherever you can, where they are offering it to you legitimately, I would say. Converse question, if you're getting vaccinated prior to transplant, how soon after the second dose of the vaccination would it be safe to get transplanted? It would be good to wait approximately 2 weeks after the last dose if possible. Another question, not really on vaccination, I guess, but when will it be safe to return to work? I work in a small enclosed space with 10 to 15 people with little social distancing.
When is it safe, after vaccination or just in general?
I think in general.
I mean,
yeah.
I think the closed space issue is an ongoing issue until community transmission decreases. Because right now, the community transmission in Boston, in the Commonwealth, in the nation is just out of control. And any closed space increases that risk. I think getting vaccinated on top of masks and whatever one can do to minimize indoor crowding, I think makes sense. But usually about 2 weeks after the vaccine immune responses emerge, 2 weeks after the second dose is when we formally measured the protection.
Okay. So I think there's some more questions about comorbidities, and I think let's have another crack at this. So certainly, I think patients who have kidney failure, regardless of whether they've been transplanted or not, counts as one comorbidity. If you have an additional comorbidity, such as diabetes or other medical conditions, that would be a second comorbidity. So I don't know that you can count kidney failure and transplant as two different comorbidities. There isn't really guidance on this. I think the other thing is, the age cutoff is another possibility for getting vaccinated sooner. So I don't know if I know you've already answered that question, Lindsey. I don't know if you.
I would just like anyone with kidney failure to be vaccinated, anyone with diabetes to be vaccinated. And it really is, how do we more rapidly deploy the vaccine, I think, is the real solution, rather than trying to parse who's higher risk. Because I think if you have significant renal dysfunction, you're at high risk.
Okay, and so I guess, a follow-up question to the one that we got before. If you do get vaccinated, how safe is it to go back to work, and do you need to change the precautions that you're taking? And do you recommend getting tested to see if you've had an antibody response? And does that change anything?
Great set of questions. Right now, whether or not you're vaccinated, you should use the same precautions. And I don't want people getting vaccinated and saying, now I can go to bars and wear no precautions and start crowding in indoor places. I think that all of us need to continue maximum infection control behaviors, which includes masks, distancing, and avoiding crowds, until the community transmission plummets and we have a better understanding of how vaccines impact transmissibility, which we don't yet have enough data. I think it will impact transmissibility. We just don't have enough data there to know how best to do guidance. But I do think by being vaccinated, it is a little bit easier to then go visit loved ones. Like, I haven't visited my 87-year-old father in a year. Now that we're all getting vaccinated, my hope is to be able to go visit him, because I think the risk has decreased, but we'll still be very careful about transmission until transmission really is controlled around us. And so I don't want people to be vaccinated and say, I no longer need to be careful. I think we need to be just as careful. The other issue is the immune response. And can we do an antibody test or something else to say, did I respond to the vaccine properly? We don't know how best to do that currently. I suspect that may emerge as a parameter that we use to understand the vaccine response. We're not there yet because we haven't developed the data, but there are plans underway to develop data that may inform us about that.
Okay. And in general, are there any other labs that you recommend for transplanted patients if they get vaccinated?
No, I don't think there's a need for any labs other than make sure that all the routine transplant care is going on. But the issue of assessing vaccine response, that we'll come up with some guidance as the data emerge to make it more rational. And I don't think it's that far away.
Okay, there's another question specifically about splenectomy. Is there any influence of splenectomy on the ability to develop a response to vaccine?
We don't know. You should still respond just fine, would be my intuition, but it's not something we've studied yet.
Okay. Question about the interval. Should we be waiting longer than 21, 28 days between doses? As you know, the UK is using a different strategy than the United States. in terms of vaccination?
So the issue of 21 days or 28 days, what's going on in the UK, and the details matter. They're using the Chadox or the AstraZeneca product. That has been studied at 0 and 3 months. So they actually have data that look at it at different intervals. And so now they're saying, how do they roll it out to maximize deployment across the country? And then what can they do with the interval so they can get more people vaccinated while they then play catch up with second vaccinations? With the mRNA or the Pfizer and Moderna products, we don't have those data. And I'm a little bit nervous about assuming things should work just fine when we don't have the data. And so I think that it's better to get the second dose somewhat delayed than not to get it, but I'm not sure we have the data to say that one dose is adequate. And that's something that will be looked at. But the data that I showed you, and I highlighted it, was that the 95% protection, particularly after day 42, all of those people got 2 doses. So we don't have long-term data beyond a month with 1 dose. So we're inferring that we think it should work. We just don't have data to reassure us that we got it right. And right now, I still think that the major problem in this country is deploying the vaccine we have rather than altering the regimen of what we have. This may become a different discussion a month or 2 from now in COVID time. Every week, it's a different world. So we have to continually reassess. But right now, I'm a little uncomfortable deviating from the proven regimens.
Okay, I'm just trying to go through the question. I think some of them are repetitive because maybe people joined late. The session is being recorded and will be available. So if we've answered your question, you think I'm not answering it, you should go back and view the beginning of the recording. A question about children. What is the recommendation for children? Is the dosing different?
So we don't have data in children. Pfizer has some data where they've age de-escalated. I know Moderna has launched pediatric studies. So we just don't have data. And those data are being generated as we speak. And once we see those data, then we'll understand what the pediatric regimen should look like. But currently, it's not known.
Okay. If you've received the flu vaccination, should you be waiting to get the COVID, or can you get them at the same time or immediately after?
You need to get the COVID vaccine. I think if you can get them at the same time, that's usually what we do, or we space it by 2 weeks. But we're in an unusual time, and I think the ability to get the COVID vaccine, one should get it, not delay it, because there's all sorts of reasons to delay it, and then it may not come as easy given the rollout challenges.
Okay. I think another very good question, I don't know if we have an answer to this, but it's to do with the uptake of the vaccine. This is basically, we are all together as a community, right, as a society, but there are a number of people who are very worried or scared about getting vaccinated. How do we as a community, as patients, as physicians, persuade others that they need to get vaccinated for everybody's sake?
That's such a complicated and important question. I think that what I hope we've learned, or sadly we've learned from COVID, is we are one community. And I actually mean that globally. We're globally one community. We're one community in Boston, and that if there is a uncontrolled respiratory virus in one part of town, it threatens all of us. And so I do think we have to think about us as one community, and how do we roll out countermeasures for all of us? Because my being vaccinated not only protects me, but protects all the patients I see today as well, plus my family, plus my friends and my supermarket and the other places I go to. And I think that we need to appreciate that. And then the other thing we need to appreciate is, how do we build trust? Because there are certain communities that don't trust the medical establishment because of bad history. And we need to take that seriously and figure out how best to build trust. One way to do it, which we spent a lot of effort, is in the phase 3 trials, is we tried to make sure that as many diverse communities were incorporated in the trial so that we could say the safety and efficacy behaved the same across all communities in the country. And then we need to have education events, community events where we have discussions, present data, present facts, have community leaders, thought leaders, community representatives all have a chance to look at the data, the information, and to build the trust that's needed that these vaccines make sense. But it's not an easy fix, and it's something that has a long history as to how we landed here. And I think we have to work systematically to build the trust so that those communities that are hesitant about vaccines can understand the potential benefit and understand the risks, which in my view are relatively small compared to the benefits.
Okay, thank you, Lindsey. It's 2:55, and I think we haven't gone to quite all of the questions. We got to most of them, so I apologize if there are people. And like I said, if you have questions that weren't answered, please send them along, and we will try to answer them efficiently. I do want to reiterate a few things. First of all, we are recommending that patients get vaccinated as soon as they can get vaccinated. I think the second thing is that if you're a patient at the Brigham Women's Hospital and you don't have Patient Gateway, get onto Patient Gateway, get yourself registered, because we will be sending updates on vaccinations as soon as we know more about it, like where you'll get vaccinated and how we intend to follow you. And of course, you can always ask questions through Patient Gateway. I would like to really thank Dr. Baden for giving up his time and sharing so much of his knowledge about this topic. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and so it's very important that we not only educate ourselves, but we educate our friends and families and colleagues. I'd also like to really thank Stacy Senat from the NKF for helping us organize this. I think this has been a great opportunity for us to interact with people participating in the community. And lastly, I would also like to say there will be a follow-up survey, so please fill in the survey. And if you have other topics that you'd like discussed in Kidney Crossroads, then suggest them. We would love to hear that, because we can then arrange for webinars based around those topics. We will be doing a number of others anyway, including the next one, which will be on March the 17th, which is World Kidney Day at 3 p.m. And that will be on race and kidney disease. And discussion will focus on racial inequity in kidney disease and transplantation. This has actually become a very interesting area because of the way that we measure kidney function and the way that we classify kidney disease. And I think it'll be a fascinating talk. We have a great panel for that one. We have Dr. Wynne Williams, who's another deputy editor for the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. Edgar Milford, Dr. Kevin Tucker, and Dr. Scattlebury, who was the first African-American transplant surgeon. And so I think that'll be a great one as well. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. We really appreciate you tuning in. Take care.